Oh,
Hey, Serena, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing
Sorry,
well.
sorry about the glitch. We did not plan through it, and the technical glitch happened at the last minute. Really sorry about that.
No worries at all. This stuff always happens. Not a big deal.
So I think I'll give a few more minutes to let everyone arrive because I know we started a little late,
Yeah, no
fortunately.
worries. No problem at all. That sounds good. How's your day? Good?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, good, good. Beautiful warm weather here, so I can't argue with that.
Great. Okay, I think I'm going to get started now. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good night, depending on where you are. Welcome to StudentPort's speaker series. My name is Serena Ding, and I am one of the administrators and co-founders of StudentPort, which is an online global community of 1,500 student leaders featuring over 200 student-run organizations, startups, and initiatives. I'm also the founder of United Under Arts, a global 501c3 nonprofit, which is dedicated to serving communities through the arts. On behalf of the founder of StudentPort, Matt, who is I don't know if he's here because he's currently on some remote exotic island somewhere, and the entire StudentPort administrative team, welcome to today's dialogue with Mr. Tom Dente. Please make sure your microphone is muted until the Q&A session, but feel free to submit your questions or your comments via the chat. And now I'm very honored and humbled to welcome Tom and host today's event. To save time, I'm not going to really reiterate Tom's impressive background, and because he has his own slides prepared, so he will go more in detail with that. But suffice it to say, he is a very trusted mentor for the young generation. He's a very passionate leader with a lot of broad and in-depth experience in both the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. And so today during his presentation, he will be giving advice to all of you young student leaders and going over his own personal journey. So without further ado, welcome Tom, and you may get started with your presentation.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining today, and it's just such a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Serena, for the nice introduction and organizing today. Before we do jump in, I thought I'd just put together some slides and talk a little bit about the nonprofit sector overall, just as a context for our conversation today, and then talk a bit about my personal journey and leave good time for dialogue back and forth as we can share our ideas and our stories and our questions and answers over the course of our session today. So that's the plan. But before we do begin, if you have access to the chat, just type in how you're feeling right now in one word. And second word, what's your role so far in the nonprofit sector? Are you interested? Are you exploring? Are you volunteering? Or are you actively working in it? Just to get a flavor for all of us who are here today. I see some motivated, working. Good, a lot of exploring, working, fantastic. Working as a founder, exploring, fantastic. Planning to start one, very exciting, yes, good. Okay, good, we'll let the last couple of those come in, and then what I'll do is I'll pivot over to some slides and just present a context for us to have our conversation today. So I'll do that. And since this is 2020, I guarantee that I will, let's see, I don't think I can see it. I think Serena, I may have to rely on you to pull the slides or make me have the ability to share my screen.
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah, thanks. Good, and I promise for those of us who've suffered through too many hours of Zoom this year, this will not be one of those long, laborious PowerPoint presentations. So good, here we go. And I can see it's coming up. Thank you very much. And it says we wait for it to load. Watching water boil.
Okay.
Very good, excellent, good. So anyway, so first of all, like I said before, just a pleasure to speak with you today. I'm inspired already looking at the chat and seeing both where you are today as we have this conversation, and also where you are as you explore, do everything from explore to start to actively work in a nonprofit sector. So let's talk a little bit about the nonprofit sector. So if we flip to the next slide, what is the sector? And this is just an example from the United States. So for those who are outside of the US, apologies for that. But what you can see using just the US sector as an example, it's large and diverse. In fact, I think it's often larger than people imagine. And so if you look at some of the data on this slide, at year end, this time a year ago, there's about 1,729,000 nonprofits registered in the United States. And if you think about that number, it's a very big number, but a lot of those organizations were still relatively small, where about 3/4 of them being under 100,000 in revenue. And in doing that work, you can see that they supported a number of different missions. So such a diversity of missions. So religious organizations, human services, people providing services to the elderly, to the homeless, to those who need food services, people involved in education, people involved in broader public or societal benefits, such as doing different types of think tank and other work, people involved in arts, culture, and the humanities. So a diverse set of missions makes up this very large sector. And if you even step back further and say, well, how does this fit within our economy overall? You see that it generates about 1.2 trillion each year, or about 5.5% of US GDP. So sizable just on that measure alone, and employing just about 7% of the total US workforce and about 10% of the private workforce. And that doesn't even count drawing upon the time and the skills of volunteers like a lot of us here. And if you step back even further and say, how does this all take place? How does this all happen? It's rests on the generosity largely of individuals, where in the United States in 2019, donations to charity totaled about $450 billion. And overall, private giving in the United States, as you can see here, is largely centered on individuals, but also foundations, bequests, where people leave some of their estate to a nonprofit, and then also corporations making up the share. So it's a large sector, it's diverse, and it really draws a lot of important resources. And if we go to the next slide, I think the reason is that each of these different organizations across all those sectors, they're guided by a mission and a purpose. And as you'll see on the next slide, Serena, if I could ask you to hit the next slide, please. Thanks. And if you see, each of these organizations is driven by a mission and a purpose. And often these missions align or directly support one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that UN member countries, plus corporations, plus organizations around the world signed on in 2015 to support. And you can see there's 17 listed here. So, for example, if you were an arts organization, you could see your work, your purpose and mission aligning to perhaps number 3, where you're providing, supporting good health and good well-being, or number 4, where you're providing and helping to support quality education, or perhaps number 11, where you're in a city and you're providing and helping to support not only sustainable cities, but also sustainable communities which rely upon arts and culture and the humanities. The organization that I ran supported largely number 17 directly, which was creating more partnerships for the goals. So the organization that I was involved in was a coalition of more than 300 international development and humanitarian groups. And together we could do more to help support the rest of these goals. And the reason why these are important in the sector is that, often this decade that we're in right now, the 20s, is really the decade to deliver, for us to take on these goals and begin to deliver some results across the world by 2030. So that large, diverse sector supporting, a set of goals that collectively the world has agreed upon. And Serena, if I could ask you to flip to the next slide. And in all this, with this mission and the purpose, the sector continues to evolve. It's very dynamic. And if you think about, by its definition, it fills a critical structural need between, if you will, government social safety nets on one side and the private sector on the other. And it's often in the middle, addressing either market externalities or market failures, or helping to support governments and other entities to provide that social safety net. So it fits the structural need, and the line between what's the domain of government services versus what is the domain of the private sector keeps shifting over time. It's also a sector that exists on trust and transparency. When trust is high and when transparency is high, the sector thrives. And it's a special sector in that it has legal standing and legal expectation to deliver social benefit, to use funding and resources fairly, and then to conserve and to serve constituencies as inclusively as possible and as equitably as possible. It's also a sector, and you may see this in some of the work that you're exploring or you've been involved in too, it's shaped by the power of social movements, from Me Too to Black Lives Matter to LGBTQ issues to taking on the climate crisis. Movements are very, powerful amplifiers and accelerators of change in society and also change in the nonprofit sector. But it doesn't do it alone. The nonprofit sector often partners with these adjacent sectors. There's a growing pool of ESG or environmental, social, and governance investors who look for organizations or companies that deliver against those goals, as well as private sector multinationals and entrepreneurs starting new social enterprises. So the pool of partners sharing that same set of purpose continues to grow. And the reason why it continues to grow is because more and more nonprofits and some of the organizations you may be involved in are addressing even more complex and more interrelated social problems, and doing it at a time when institutional trust is often at an all-time low globally, not just in the United States, in the trust in governments, trust in businesses, and trust in other institutions. So it has a special role to play in solving problems as a trusted actor to do so. And if we could move to the next slide, Serena. And so what's happened? Obviously, 2020 has been a very different year from those before. And COVID has really, I think, in a lot of ways, accelerated some of the changes that perhaps we already saw in the sector. On the very positive side, I think it revealed a very resourceful, resilient sector. So you saw nonprofits delivering services virtually or using new methods. Think about what you saw if you're in New York in the spring and into the summer, with different organizations coming up with brand new ways to engage volunteers, to engage their communities, to deliver services. Most of the nonprofits also had to transition to working remotely. So having their teams distributed, not all working in one place, which for some was a change. For others, it was what they had been set up to do, but certainly calling upon technology to work remotely, to be effective remotely in different ways. It also called upon new fundraising approaches where a lot of nonprofits that rely upon uh, events such as large galas, large in-person events, you can no longer do that. So what are the new fundraising approaches that gain that same sense of engagement and that same sense of commitment to the nonprofit? So a lot of work to do that because the fundraising is so critical to delivering the mission. And then also in all of this, just changing the operating models. How do we do things differently? And COVID forcing us to do things differently as we think about our missions and how we're structured organizationally, what our processes look like, and then how we deliver our services or our benefits. And then I think the last point too, you saw funders, be these individual donors to large foundations and philanthropists stepping up with additional support and unrestricted resources, meaning resources that a nonprofit could use for its own larger benefit, not tied to a specific program. But funders stepping up to say, we recognize COVID is a challenge, not only for our whole economy, but also for nonprofits. So we need to be able to provide more resources to help the organizations navigate through this time. So a lot of positives revealed in the stress and in the challenge of COVID. But then I think also some more fragility in the sector too. Often, if you're a nonprofit, you found that there was more demand for your services than capacity. Think if you were providing after school services or you're providing different forms of mental health or healthcare services. You also have your team trying to work in this new environment, and your team could be pretty stressed in doing that, especially as the pandemic continued on and on and on. And then some challenges in gaining traditional funding. If you're very good at events or very good at other types of in-person fundraising sessions, it became harder. It became harder. Often too, if you were a nonprofit, you had limited operating reserves or funds that you could draw upon that you had earned over time in the course of your work that you could then help to make up for some of the funding that you hadn't perhaps received and be able to keep your team in place or to keep delivering your programs. But the reality was that this is in the United States. There was about a loss of about 1.6 million nonprofit jobs in March as the pandemic began to make its way through the United States. It has recovered somewhat to about 700,000 jobs lost by October. But no surprise, you saw organizations like arts and education, museums, suffering some of the largest declines in employment. Healthcare, again, no surprise, probably the least. And a bunch of different estimates took place over this period of time, where this time of more stress on the nonprofit sector. And there's an organization called Candid that did some modeling, and they estimated that an additional 22,000 nonprofits could close due to the COVID-19 crisis. And again, all US-based numbers for our international group. But again, probably a similar set of trends in the countries in which you're working or in which you're living. And so if we move to the next slide, Serena, putting this all together, looking ahead, this is a time of profound change. There's going to be ongoing stress, even beyond COVID, on traditional models. And I think here's the exciting part, especially for all of you as you do your work. There is a profound need for innovation to address global health issues, economic distress, social justice issues, systemic racism, economic inequality, the climate crisis especially. And that innovation, needs to come from the nonprofit sector. And in doing that, I think it'll be a time of nonprofits adopting a variety of new approaches, new partnerships, new operating models, new practices, especially around how you measure impact, taking on and building new digital capabilities, new funding models, ranging from crowdsourcing to impact investing, and then also continuing to explore how do we more radically include our stakeholders in the work that we do so that we live up to our values of being an equitable organization who serves others as fairly as we can. And so if you step back from all that, I think what the sector really needs is all of you. It needs new talent, it needs new ideas, it needs diverse voices and leadership, it needs courage, determination, and creativity to take us from this time of stress to this time of innovation. And I think that's the exciting part, for me as I look ahead. So we can pick up on questions a bit afterward if you have any questions about what we just covered in the sector. But let me tell you a little bit about how I got involved. And so, Serena, if you don't mind clicking to the next slide. So here's my journey, which is probably a little bit atypical. So I started off, I was an undergrad economics major. I worked in a management consulting firm, a private sector management consulting firm. I earned an MBA, so I had a very traditional business-based background. As a management consultant, I worked with clients all over the world and helping them with strategy and organizational and performance improvement issues. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the work and what I was doing. And then just about 11 years ago, maybe 12 years ago at this point, like all of us, life happens. And my wife came down and she was sick with cancer. And in helping think through that time, and as we recovered from that time, what became very important to me was, to explore how do I shift to make my work matter more. And so that led me to leaving management consulting, spending a year of learning where I worked on a variety of different projects with foundations, different women's empowerment groups, different think tanks to help take everything I'd learned before and then make it relevant, as I believe, to the nonprofit sector. And then after that year of learning, that led me to become first the chief operating officer and then the CEO of a nonprofit called Inside NGO that supported international development and humanitarian NGOs. So we had more than 300 members around the world, some of the largest and some of the smallest development and humanitarian groups. And then after I'd taken on that role, I ended up merging my nonprofit with two others, one that was based in the UK and then one that was based in the US to form a brand new organization that was able to better deliver upon our mission with the additional resources and additional capabilities. And then along the way, I began to also advise and to serve on nonprofit boards. So everyone's learning journey and career path will be unique to them. But I think if I step back from this, I think what strikes me in looking at it again is just how I think now more and more you see people crossing sectors, more and more you see people's learning continuing all the way through the course of their career. And then also you just see that everything you learn will help you as you continue in your career. So some of the things that I learned when I was just starting off as a management consultant, I was able to draw upon years and years later as I was involved in, for example, merging 3 nonprofits together, which is quite a task. So anyway, happy to talk more about my journey, but it's certainly been exciting, and I'm happy to share more of that story. Good. So I think that's the end of the slide. So happy to stop there just to provide a brief overview of the sector in which I'm excited to play a role in, and it sounds like a lot of you are as well, and share a little bit of my journey. But happy to take some questions and hear some of your ideas as well.
All right, well, thanks, Tom. That was a very insightful and informative presentation. And I think your call for the need for new ideas and diverse voices and leadership it's very much a wake-up call for us Generation Zers. And I know that many of the student leaders, they really want to drive social changes and make a lasting impact, but sometimes they struggle with turning their ideas into implementable actions and tangible results. So before we open for questions from the audience, I was wondering if I could, ask you a few questions that I think are most pertinent to the student leaders that I personally know. So I wanted to ask specifically about your personal transition from corporate America to the nonprofit sector. And I guess what made you change your trajectory into the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, I think, I think for me, and I touched upon it briefly before, but, when my wife was sick, and she's recovered now, she had cancer, but when breast cancer, which unfortunately so many, women are afflicted with, at that time when your family is facing stress and challenge, comes a time when you look and you say, can I do more? Does my work matter? What more can I do? And for me, that led me to just ask some good questions about how can I take all the skills that I've learned and apply them, to organizations where perhaps I could be of greater benefit. And so that's what led me down that path to do that. It was quite a jumping off point, as you can imagine. So I was a partner in my last consulting firm, and really enjoyed that work and what I was doing. And to I feel very grateful to have had the time to make that switch. And then in some ways too, and I think this is an important takeaway too, to take on that beginner's mind again. Where I've been, you get very comfortable at a certain point when you're in a role, when you're in a position, when you're in a school, when you're in a community, and to be able to start fresh and to be a beginner again was really exciting in some ways. And I think it drew uh, different attributes for me, curiosity. I became a better listener. I was able to, I think, be even more effective in becoming a beginner again and learning about the nonprofit sector after spending most of my career in the corporate sector.
What would you say are some of the biggest differences between like a for-profit business and a nonprofit?
Yeah, I think there's several, but at least three. I think one is that if we're in a corporate business, how do we measure success? We measure success by profitability. It's a pretty straightforward measure. It's a lot harder in the nonprofit sector where you're trying to measure impact. You're trying to say, did we make a difference for the communities we serve? And that measurement of impact is going to vary depending upon your mission. And so how you measure success is very different. I think the second thing is that if you're a for-profit, you have access to a lot more capital. You can draw, capital from the capital markets, from banks, and from others. And often nonprofits struggle with that. So you have a very different emphasis on fundraising over time. And then I think lastly, nonprofits have a much more complex set of challenges and stakeholders that they are trying to assist. If we're starting a brand new nonprofit, for example, here where I am in New Rochelle to help people with food insecurity, there's a lot of people that we have to involve in that effort. And so managing different stakeholders makes it in some ways a a more challenging role in order to deliver effectively. But I think that what's interesting though is there's been a general movement to bring the two together, and these boundaries between nonprofit, for-profit are blurring. So just last year in the United States, the Business Roundtables, made up of some of the largest corporations, they released a statement in October that said that corporations should be managed for the benefit of stakeholders, not just shareholders, and stakeholders including communities and their employees and others. And so I think that was very important. And then also a lot of corporations have begun to put in place and align their work around the SDGs that I discussed before, or other types of measures. And then you start to see social benefit corporations beginning to emerge. And so that's on the corporate side, they're moving closer. And then on the other side, nonprofits are exploring how do we rethink our business models or our operating models? And then how do we take advantage of new financial structures like impact investing that bring capital together with social benefit problems? And then I think finally, this is perhaps where it would come back to all of you. I think talent will continue to shift back and forth across sectors and, into the government sector as well. So I think, the days of you're just stuck in one silo are gone. People are moving back and forth a lot more regularly.
And what were some of the biggest challenges that you had to personally overcome while running a nonprofit?
Yeah, you can imagine, lots, right? I'm sure if I had my team here, they would give you a list of probably dozens and dozens. But I think for me, it was, I had to learn about different financial reporting. A nonprofit is different from, um, a for-profit in the sense of, how do you report your results? So I had to learn that. I had to learn about new financial structures such as grants. What is a grant? How do you account for that? How do you maintain compliance with that? And then I think, for me specifically, we were serving the international development and the humanitarian sector. So learning about what does humanitarian response look like that our members were delivering? How do our members deliver global health? And really learning about their missions was a lot to learn, so that I could be relevant in supporting them. But I think I was really fortunate in that when I first was the chief operating officer, I worked closely with our founder who she was incredibly patient and she was always there to answer my questions and really help mentor me and opened a lot of doors for me that honestly helped make me successful.
So I know you actually just mentioned one of your biggest problems was regarding grants and stuff. And similarly, a lot of student nonprofits struggle to get funding. So do you have any tips on an emerging student nonprofit, where to apply for funding, how to look for it?
Yeah, it's a good. It's like it's the hardest question in some ways, especially if you go back to those numbers that I showed before, where there's 1.7 million nonprofits in the United States, for example, if you're looking to raise funding in the U.S. So I think the first thing is you have to be clear about your mission. Here's who we are, here's how we achieve results, and being able to tell your story around your impact and the benefits that you're bringing is important. So that clarity, number one, really helps. And I think that's hard in the first years of any nonprofit because you're still trying to deliver while you're raising funding, and that story may not be as clear in terms of the your ability to um, engage people in what you're trying to do. What you should do, I think, often is, there are a lot of different support groups that exist to help nonprofits. And I think instead of going it alone as you're just starting off, taking advantage of support groups. So if you're in the New York, greater New York City area, there's an excellent organization called Nonprofit New York. And what they do, you can become a member, and they provide different kinds of training and networking, training on fundraising, training on resource development. And so I think, looking for support organizations is helpful. And then with that clarity of your story, with support organizations who can help you bring that capacity or those capabilities that you may have, then just, continuing to get out there and to engage, recognizing that, it takes time to build those relationships and have that trusted relationship whereby someone will make a donation or someone will grant. The other thing that, though, I think is making this somewhat more democratic, though, is with crowd uh, funding. There are more platforms emerging that create access to different types of donors and different types of givers. So that's something to also look out for too.
What are some tools that you would recommend that nonprofits use to keep track of their finances?
Oh, good question. I think first, often if you're just starting off and you're small, Google Sheets or Excel, is often a starting point. But for smaller nonprofits, I know a lot use QuickBooks Online, which is a package software that automates and makes it very easy to produce income statements, balance sheet, and to manage your transactions appropriately. So that seems to be a standard that people use. As you get larger and more complicated, there are obviously bigger financial management or general ledger packages that exist. But often I find a lot of nonprofits, or especially the smaller ones, are using some version of QuickBooks or QuickBooks Online.
All right. Well, I think those are mostly my questions based on what I know of what student leaders struggle with and what some of them have asked me to ask you because some of them could not be here today. But now if any of you guys in the audience have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And yeah, we'll go from there. So just drop them in the chat, or if you want to directly ask, just you can unmute and ask your question.
Good. I'm just pulling up the chat. So good. So a couple questions just to pick them off the top there. Oh, definitely, Samantha. Happy to share, the presentation for today. And if you have any questions about it, please do feel free to reach out. So happy to do that. Let's see. Next question about efficient fundraising so we can produce greater project. Any advice for us, particularly regarding grants and donors? Oh, good question. You know, running a youth-run gender equality nonprofit. The good thing there is there's certainly a clarity of, a clarity of purpose, as I was mentioning before. In terms of, being able to look for different types of grants and different types of resources that may be available. I mentioned before, and I think it was referred to in one of the slides, an organization called Candid, which is a merger of two organizations called GuideStar and the Foundation Center. And often they're a very good resource for identifying different types of funders and donors. Also, there's organizations such as Charity Navigator and others which provide a view on different types of organizations that may be similar to yours. And for the organizations that are similar to yours, it may be easy to see what types of funders they have reached out to and to see if they would also be willing to fund you. Good. Moving down the questions, and so I apologize if I miss anyone's questions. Please do stop me and shout out. Oh, the nonprofit, asking which nonprofit organizations I've worked for. I've worked for two. One was called Inside NGO, and then that organization was the organization I started at, and then I took that organization and I merged it with two others to form Humentum, which stood for Human Momentum. Then I've also served on the board of an organization called currently called PM for NGOs, and then also an organization called Interaction. I've served on that board as well. And then the question was, could you go into specific and strategies on how nonprofit organizations can accumulate and manage funds? It's a really important question because if you think about your ability to deliver services, if you have generated a number of funds and you have some expenses against those funds at the end of the year, ideally you have some surplus or some operating contribution. And with that, then you can save that and then you can, build that operating reserve over time. I think often nonprofits have a mix of revenue sources. So you have grants from some organizations. You may have a contract to deliver services from a government. You may also have individual donations, and then also you may have your own events. So my organization, for example, what we used to do is we had membership dues. So members would provide us dues, or we would provide learning services for them. So we had a fee for income service that we would generate fees from the services we would deliver, and that helped us accumulate funds over time. But I think you hit upon in your question one of the bigger challenges, which is how do we get all the revenue mix right so that we can generate operating surpluses so that we can build a pool of funds that we can then appropriately invest or hold as part of an operating reserve so that we have funds in the event of a crisis like COVID. Next question was, how do you file for 501c3 status? It's the good thing about this is that there's a number of, if you go to the IRS.gov website, there's some pretty specific set of instructions for how you can apply for that, and then how you can apply at your state to be registered, at the state level as well. And different states have different requirements. So, New York has a different set of requirements than other U.S. states. So, you have to, be incorporated and then, complete the requirements for the 501c3. I think the good news on 501c3, when you start to look at that, and we didn't talk about this as much, but once you do receive a federal 501c3 status, you do have to then do follow-on reporting every year. You have to file an annual Form 990. And again, the good news on that is that it varies based upon your size. So if you were an organization and you had less than 50,000, say, in revenue, your filing of that 990 is very abbreviated. In fact, it's the size of a postcard. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of that requirement. Yeah, exactly. And I see some of the comments. So, good. Next question. How do you explain the difference between an NGO and a nonprofit organization? Good question. It's like in some cases, it's, nonprofit technically is a tax status, and an NGO, a non-governmental organization. In some ways, they would overlap, but you could have a non-governmental organization that could be a for-profit contractor. They could be providing those services, for to earn a slight profit. For example, providing vaccination services, in a certain country. They would be an NGO, but they would also be, they would not be a nonprofit. Good. A lot of good questions about. We're relatively new. We're focused on coding, education, and again, a lot of questions about finding donors and grants in the COVID era. Really important questions. Yeah, it's like this is probably the hardest question. We probably have a whole session with others on, how do you fund your nonprofit appropriately? Given you're just getting started, you're just getting your story to tell, you're just starting to show your results. I think the good thing is that when you're just getting started, your funding requirements are probably a lot less just to get underway than others. So you may be able to tap into either crowdsourced or individual donors who can help you get started before even taking on some of the challenges of specific grants with all the requirements, both to apply, to be awarded, and then to be compliant with the grant. Let me stop there and see if I've missed any questions. And Serena, if I could ask you to be my conscience on this and see if I have. I just picked up one right at the end from Katie. What are some common misconceptions about nonprofits? What's next for your organization? Some common misconceptions are often there's this movement that nonprofits should be more like businesses, and I think there's this perception that nonprofits perhaps aren't run as effectively or efficiently. And I found, in my work, quite the opposite, that they're incredibly effective, often because they have, in some cases, a scarcity of resources. And so that forces you to be more efficient, more effective, use your people and funding resources even better than, a for-profit would do. So I think that's often a misconception. The second one I would think too is that that there's also a perception that nonprofits are, while they have a social purpose, perhaps their leaders don't have business skills. And I found just the opposite, that with the ability to be great managers, I found that some of the best leaders that I've ever had a chance to work with, and some of the best managers, came from the nonprofit sector as opposed to the for-profit sector. And what's next for me? So I left my organization just about a year ago to get recentered in New York. My organization was based in DC. So I was tired, honestly, going back and forth. But it's been really nice to kind of get recentered in New York, or the greater New York City area, where I live, and to continue to support the organization that I'm on the board for, and continue to offer advice and be a mentor for friends and colleagues where I can. And then Jalen has a question. What do you suggest to do in the growing of a nonprofit? Good question. It's like, it would depend specifically on, the type of nonprofit that you have. And I think part of it is once you get started, it's so hard to generalize. I struggle a little bit with this question, but I think part of it is surround yourself with good people when you get started. Not necessarily even working for your nonprofit, but having a good board helps. Having good team members when you can bring them on helps. Having good advisors, having good partners helps. And so I think a nonprofit doesn't do it alone. It does it both with that human capital of board, plus the team, plus partners, and really thinking about, who are the people who can help me both take what I have and then take it to the next level as I grow, and what are the skills that I'm going to need to take it from a starting place to that next stage to the stage after that.
Okay, I don't think there are any more questions that I can see that you did not answer, so I'm just gonna close the event now with the closing. Let me reshare my screen for a moment. Sorry. All right, so Tom, thank you so much for the insightful dialogue today. I'm sure I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of other people learned a lot as well. And for those students, if you want to join us on StudentPort, you can scan the QR code here. It's on Discord, and basically it's just a community full of a bunch of students that have started their own organization or are planning to, and basically we give advice to each other and share resources. So you can scan the QR code here, or you can go to our website, which is studentport.space.
Good. If before I sign off, if you just a couple seconds, so Serena, I just want, first of all, I want to thank you. I think I'm inspired, by what the questions you're asking, the work that you're doing, because I think the social problems are bigger and more complex, and they need you. So first of all, thank you for that. And then, second, I think, if I were to offer any advice based on my own experience, for what it's worth, keep learning. This will be a learning journey as you get involved in the sector in whatever form you do. And so, keep learning, keep gaining experiences. It's never a linear path, but it's a time of creativity and innovation. And I think, each of you can bring that to whatever organization you happen to serve. I think, also just thinking about what areas, and it looked like a lot of, work around education and a variety of different quality and coding initiatives that you're involved in, but, find what you're passionate about. That's really important too. If you're passionate about a cause or an issue, once you find that, then I think, that makes a lot of things easier. And then as I was saying before, when we talked about how to grow nonprofits, surround yourself with good people, mentors, advisors, other people who can help you. And then, find ways to help to collaborate with other organizations. I'm really struck by, StudentPort being a great collaboration space where you can share ideas and you can share insights and you can support each other. And, finding collaboration platforms is so important. And so continuing to find those. And then, lastly, fall in love with the problem that you're trying to solve and not necessarily the solution. And what I mean by that is that, things will change as you go along your journey. And you may have to adjust your solution or what you think is the right answer and the services that you offer. So be willing to do that, and I think you'll be really successful. And I think, just to close out, one of my favorite authors is a U.S. 19th century writer, Henry Thoreau, who wrote Walden, for those of you who may have read that, and also On Civil Disobedience. And this quote has always stuck with me because it's like the challenge of being, as all of you are, involved in a nonprofit. You've built your castles in the air. You have this mission, you have this purpose. It's important, it's relevant, and that's okay. You should have those high aspirations and those high missions and those high sense of purpose in terms of what you can be done. But the trick is to put the foundations under them so that you can deliver the results. And we've talked about some of those foundations, from having good people to good financial management to continuing to look for ways to collaborate. And so for me, that's the nonprofit journey: having those castles in the air and then the foundations underneath them, and not losing those aspirations, but also being very grounded in what you're trying to accomplish and what it really takes. So again, it's just a pleasure to speak with you tonight, and look forward to any questions that you may have after this, and more than happy to be in touch.
And then right before we all leave, I just wanted to let everyone know that our next speaker series will be on December 9th from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. and we will be speaking with Sonia Sepaban. She was an engineer for NASA for about a decade, and has led multiple Fortune 500 companies. And we will be discussing with her about her experiences in STEM and in the corporate sector. And we will be sending that out on StudentPort. So thank you all today for joining. And if you have any questions to Tom, do you want to, I guess, drop an email or some way that people can contact you in the chat?
Yeah, let me drop it in right now.
All right, so thank you, Tom, for coming today, and thank you everyone else for showing up, and have a great day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all.